If your last name is on this list, there is something about its history you may never have heard. Because some of the most ordinary Mexican surnames have traveled through an extraordinary history. They passed through medieval Spain. They survived religious persecution, forced conversions, and exile. Some were carried across the Atlantic into New Spain. And in certain families, these surnames became connected to Sephardic Jewish communities, whose descendants eventually became part of the fabric of Mexico. But before we begin, there is something important to understand. Having one of these surnames does not prove that you are Jewish or Sephardic. Many of these names were common Spanish or Portuguese surnames and were used by Christians, Jews, and converts alike. What makes them fascinating is that historical records show that some Sephardic families carried, adopted, or retained these names. So if your surname appears here, think of it as a clue to investigate, not a DNA test. These are 8 Mexican surnames with unexpected Sephardic connections. Number 8. Aguilar. Aguilar sounds completely Spanish. And it is. The name is a habitational surname connected to several places called Aguilar in Spain, including Aguilar de la Frontera and Aguilar de Campo. But there is another layer to its history. Genealogical references identify Aguilar as a surname that was also adopted by Sephardic Jews who converted to Roman Catholicism, with some descendants later retaining the Catholic surname after returning to Judaism. And Aguilar is not some obscure surname in Mexico. Family search records show it is extremely common there. So if your family is Aguilar, the name itself doesn't tell you exactly where your ancestors came from. But it does open a fascinating historical door. Because behind one ordinary Spanish surname were families whose religious identities sometimes changed simply to survive. Number 7. Castro. Castro is another surname that looks completely ordinary in the Spanish-speaking world. Its origin is associated with the Latin word castrum, referring to a fortress or fortified place. But Castro also has a documented Sephardic association. Family search describes Castro as a Galician, Portuguese, and Jewish, including Sephardic surname. And Mexican records contain generations of people carrying the name. That doesn't mean every Mexican Castro descends from a Jewish family. A family could carry a perfectly Christian-looking Spanish surname, while its deeper history was much more complicated. And that is what makes these names so difficult to read from the outside. Number 6. Espinoza. Espinoza sounds like a name that could have been in Mexico forever. And in a sense, it has. The surname comes from places in Spain called Espinoza, associated with espina, meaning thorn. But historical surname references also identify Espinoza as a name adopted by some Sephardic Jews following conversion to Catholicism. Today, Espinoza is common in Mexico. That makes the story even more interesting, because when a surname becomes widespread, its original history can become almost invisible. Thousands of families can carry the same name while having completely different ancestral stories. One Espinoza family might have purely Christian Iberian roots. Another might have indigenous ancestry. Another could have a Sephardic connection. The surname alone cannot tell you which one is yours. Number 5. Medina. Now this one gets particularly interesting. Medina is a Spanish surname with a place name origin. It comes from Arabic Madna, meaning city, and is associated with places such as Medina Sidonia and Medina del Campo in Spain. But Medina also became associated with Sephardic Jewish families. Family Search specifically notes that Medina was also adopted by some Sephardic Jews at conversion to Roman Catholicism, with descendants sometimes retaining the surname generations later. And Medina is heavily represented in Mexican genealogical records. So a Mexican Medina could be carrying a surname whose linguistic history passes through Spanish, Arabic, and Jewish history all at once. One name, several layers of history. Number 4. Herrera. Pereira takes us slightly away from Castilian Spain and into the Portuguese world. The name comes from Portuguese and Galician Pereira, meaning pear tree, and originally functioned as a topographic or habitational surname. But Pereira also has a documented Sephardic history. Family Search notes that the surname was adopted by some Sephardic Jews following conversion to Catholicism. And that matters because Portuguese New Christians played an important role in Atlantic migration. Some converted Jews and their descendants moved through Portugal, Spain, the Atlantic Islands, and eventually the Americas, while carrying Christian names. So when you encounter Pereira in a Latin American family tree, you cannot simply look at the surname and announce an ancestry. You have to follow the records. And sometimes those records lead somewhere very unexpected. Number 3, Toledano. This surname practically tells you where to look. Toledano means someone associated with Toledo. And Toledo was one of the most important Jewish centers of medieval Spain. Family Search identifies Toledano as both Spanish and Jewish Sephardic, derived from Toledo, and the surname is also found in Mexican genealogical records. This is one of the cases where the surname itself carries a geographical memory. Imagine a family leaving Toledo centuries ago. Generation after generation passes. The family moves. Languages change. Countries change. Religions may change. But the name survives. And eventually, someone in Mexico is still signing that same family name. That is what makes surnames so fascinating. They can preserve pieces of geography long after people have forgotten where the name came from. Number 2, Perez. Perez is one of the most common Spanish surnames in Mexico. It simply means son of Pedro, but there is another side to the name. Family Search identifies Perez as a surname that was also adopted by some Sephardic Jews after conversion to Roman Catholicism, with some descendants retaining it after returning to Judaism generations later. And this is where things become particularly interesting, because a surname can become so common that people stop asking where it came from. Perez could belong to a Christian family. It could belong to a family with indigenous ancestry. It could belong to a family with Sephardic ancestry. The name alone cannot decide. But historical evidence tells us that Sephardic families did use it. So if you are Perez, the interesting question isn't, does my surname prove I'm Jewish? It doesn't. The better question is, what does my particular family tree reveal? Number 1, Lopez. Lopez comes from the medieval personal name Lope, and it became one of the most widespread Spanish surnames. But Lopez also appears in genealogical references describing Sephardic adoption of Spanish surnames after conversion to Catholicism. That is an important pattern we're seeing again and again. The Spanish Inquisition and the forced conversion of Jews created a strange historical situation. Some people who had once lived openly as Jews became Catholic publicly. Their descendants could inherit the Christian names their families had adopted. Centuries later, there was no obvious way to look at the surname and know what had happened. The name survived. The story disappeared. And perhaps the strangest thing about all of this is that your surname may be one of the oldest pieces of history you carry without realizing it. But a surname isn't a DNA test. It isn't proof of religion. And it isn't proof that every person carrying the name shares the same ancestry. It is a clue, a thread, a place where your family story might begin. Because the same surname could belong to completely different families who lived completely different lives. If your surname appeared in this video, write it in the comments and tell us where your family is from. You might be surprised by how many people share the same story.